On the afternoon of June the 1st, 2014, an ambulance idled on the driveway of a private residence in Kitsap County, Washington. Carrie Kasem stood on the front lawn, holding a court order and waiting for paramedics to bring her father out. Casey Kasem was 82 years old and dying upstairs, bedridden, unable to speak, suffering from infections and bed sores that his daughter had only recently been permitted to see. She had legal authority. She had medical personnel. She had spent months in courtrooms across 2 states to reach this moment. And then the ambulance was called away. In the confusion that followed, the front door opened, and Casey's wife, Jean, walked out onto the lawn and threw a pound of raw hamburger meat at her stepdaughter. Cameras recorded the entire thing. Upstairs, behind the windows, the most beloved voice in American radio lay silent, unable to intervene, unable to call out, unable to do anything except exist as the contested center of a family that had come completely apart. Casey Kasem had spent nearly 4 decades as the warm, familiar presence behind American Top 40 and the voice of Shaggy and Scooby-Doo. He signed off every broadcast with the same 7 reassuring words. Millions of Americans trusted him the way they trusted the sound of their own weekends. Almost none of them knew what was happening inside his family. This is the story of a self-made broadcasting legend, a second wife, 3 children locked outside the gates, and a fight over one man's body that stretched from Los Angeles to Washington state to a cemetery in Norway. It spans decades, courtrooms, and an estate worth as much as $100 million. And it did not end when Casey Kasem died. The public knew Casey Kasem as one of the gentlest voices in American entertainment. For nearly 4 decades, he counted down the nation's favorite songs with a warmth that made millions of strangers feel like he was speaking directly to them. And he signed off every broadcast with the same 7 words: keep your feet on the ground and keep reaching for the stars. He was the original voice of Shaggy and Scooby-Doo. He was Robin in Super Friends. He was, in the most literal sense, the soundtrack to other people's weekends, their road trips, their long-distance dedications, their first slow dances. His name conjured a particular kind of American Sunday. Unhurried, familiar, safe. But the real story of Casey Kasem's final years had nothing to do with countdowns or cartoon characters. It was about isolation, about control, about competing children and a second wife, and a man who lost the ability to speak while everyone around him screamed. It was about a body that disappeared and a grave in Norway. And to understand how a voice synonymous with warmth ended up at the center of something this ugly, intimate, and absurd, you have to go back to the beginning, to a grocery store in Detroit, a war in Korea, and a young man who discovered that his voice could make people trust him. Casey Kasem was born Kamal Amin Kasem on April 27, 1932, in Detroit, Michigan. His parents were Lebanese immigrants who ran a small grocery store, and the household was modest in the way that first-generation American families often are. Defined by work, shaped by the old country's expectations, oriented towards survival rather than display. There was no entertainment pedigree, no family wealth, no name that opened doors in any industry. Detroit in the 1930s and 40s was a city built on manufacturing and labor, not media, and the Kasem family's world was the world of small business, immigrant community, and the particular kind of American striving that starts with a shop counter and a second language. What set Casey apart was a sensitivity to sound, to rhythm, to the emotional architecture of how words land when spoken aloud. He gravitated toward radio the way some children gravitate toward instruments, not as a career aspiration, but as a sensory home. It was the medium that made sense to him, the one where his instincts felt most alive. He studied at Wayne State University and during the Korean War served as a disc jockey and announcer on the American Forces Korea Network. That military broadcasting assignment is easy to pass over as a biographical footnote, but it shaped everything Casey became. The soldiers listening to his broadcasts were not a typical audience. They were young men far from home, living under conditions of uncertainty and fear, and the voice coming through their radios was, for some of them, the closest thing they had to the world they had left behind. Casey learned, in those years, that a voice transmitted across distance to people who were lonely and afraid could function as a kind of companionship, not because of what it said specifically, but because of how it made the listener feel. Not entertained, not informed, accompanied. He carried that lesson home to civilian life. And every professional decision he made for the next 5 decades was shaped by it. He was not trying to be famous. He was trying to be familiar. He was trying to be the sound that made people feel less alone. That instinct would make him one of the most beloved broadcasters in American history. It would also make the contrast with his final years almost unbearable to contemplate. After Korea, Casey worked his way through local radio stations across the western United States, moving from market to market, building credibility one shift at a time. He took voice acting work wherever he could find it: commercial spots, small animation roles, the kind of jobs that keep the lights on while a career develops its shape. There was no single breakthrough moment. There was instead a long accumulation of competence and reliability that only becomes visible in retrospect. Casey Kasem was not a prodigy and not an overnight sensation. He was a craftsman. He showed up, he performed, he learned the rhythms of American popular taste by spending thousands of hours surrounded by it. And by the time American Top 40 debuted on July 4th, 1970, he had been preparing for the role for nearly 2 decades without knowing it existed. The show changed everything, but it changed everything because Casey was ready for it. American Top 40 was not simply a chart rundown. It was a weekly ritual built on the anticipation, narrative, and emotional connection. The rankings created suspense. Listeners wanted to know what was climbing, what was falling, what would claim the number one spot. The trivia and backstory Casey wove between songs created texture, a sense that the music was embedded in a larger human story rather than floating in a vacuum. And the long distance dedications, those carefully selected listener letters about soldiers stationed overseas, about couples separated by geography, about parents and children reaching across distance through the medium of a shared song, created an intimacy that no other radio format had achieved. Casey read those dedications with a sincerity that millions of people believed because it was, by most accounts, genuine. He cared about the stories. He cared about the people. His voice was not a performance of warmth. It was warmth refined and channeled through a microphone and a format that let it reach more people than any dinner table or living room ever could. For 39 years, across various network incarnations and format changes, Casey counted down the hits. He was inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame. He received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He became the voice of Shaggy and Scooby-Doo, a role he performed for decades, lending his particular warmth to a cartoon character who became, in his own unlikely way, as recognizable as the countdown itself. He was also the voice of Robin in Super Friends, adding another layer to the generational footprint. Children who grew up listening to the Top 40 with their parents on weekend drives also heard Casey's voice on Saturday mornings without necessarily connecting the two. That kind of ubiquity is rare, and it is different from fame. Casey Kasem was not a celebrity in the way actors and musicians and athletes are celebrities. He was something more diffuse and in certain respects more powerful. He was a presence, a reliable, recurring, almost ambient warmth that threaded through American popular culture for 40 years without ever demanding the kind of attention that creates backlash. People did not have strong opinions about Casey Kasem. They had a feeling, and the feeling was trust. The dynasty that grew around that trust was not built on inherited money or social standing, or the kind of multi-generational wealth that characterizes the families this channel usually examines. It was built entirely on voice. Casey Kasem was a self-made man in the most literal sense, a child of immigrant grocers who turned the instrument of his own vocal cords into a career, a fortune, and a household name. That origin matters because it sets the stakes for everything that went wrong. This was not a family with deep roots in privilege. This was one man's achievement, concentrated in one lifetime. And when that man's body and mind began to fail, the structure he had built had no foundation beneath it except the relationships he had maintained or neglected. Those relationships, it turned out, were not strong enough to hold. By the early 1970s, Casey Kasem had achieved the thing that most American broadcasters spend their entire careers chasing and never quite reach: genuine household familiarity. He was not just on the radio, he was in the fabric of people's weekends. Families drove with the countdown on in the background. Teenagers recorded the Top 40 on cassette tapes so they could listen to the dedications again. His voice had become a kind of public utility, Always there, always the same temperature, always pointing toward the reassuring conclusion that music could organize feeling, and that a countdown, unlike most things in life, would always reach number one. And the social world that Casey and his growing career inhabited reflected that particular kind of Los Angeles success, not old money, not East Coast society, but the warm, informal prestige of a man who was liked by everyone and threatening to no one. He was invited to industry events not because he was powerful, but because he was pleasant. He was recognized in restaurants and airports not because he was controversial, but because he was comforting. That quality, the absence of edges, the warmth without heat, would make the events of his final years all the more disorienting to the public. This was not a man anyone expected trouble from. Casey married Linda Myers in 1972, and together they had 3 children: Carrie, Mike, and Julie. The marriage lasted 7 years. It ended in 1979 when Casey was at the height of his professional momentum, and the household he left behind contained 3 young children who would grow up understanding their father primarily through the particular lens of a celebrity divorce. Weekends and holidays, scheduled visits, the awareness that the men millions of Americans associated with warmth and constancy was present in their lives only intermittently and on terms set by lawyers and calendars. That is not to say Casey was an absent father. Multiple accounts from the children's later public statements suggest genuine affection and real engagement during the time they spent together. But the architecture of the relationship was shaped by distance. The older children knew what it was like to want more of Casey than they were given. That knowledge would become central to everything that happened at the end of his life. In 1980, Casey married the actress Jane Thompson, and the second chapter of the Kasem family began. Jane was not a woman who disappeared into her husband's shadow. She had a career of her own, recurring roles on Cheers and its spin-off The Tortelli, a screen presence that placed her inside the entertainment world on her own terms. She was, by the accounts of people who knew the couple socially, vivid, commanding, glamorous, and protective of the life she was building with Casey in a way that could feel warm or territorial, depending on where you stood in relation to the gates. In 1989, Casey gave Jean a birthday present that tells you everything about the scale of the world they inhabited. A mansion in Holmby Hills, one of the most exclusive enclaves in Los Angeles. A neighborhood where the homes are measured in tens of millions of dollars and the hedges are measured in the privacy they provide. The Kasem house had a heart-shaped swimming pool and the kind of architectural grandeur that signaled not merely wealth, but an investment in display. It was a home designed to be admired and at the same time to keep the outside world at a distance. That duality would come to define the entire Kasem story. In 1990, Jean and Casey's daughter Liberty was born. The family that would eventually tear itself apart was now complete. Casey Kasem had 4 children, 3 from his first marriage, 1 from his second, 2 households, 2 mothers, 2 sets of memories, loyalties, grievances, and expectations. On paper, blended families are common in America. Millions of people navigate the complexity of step-parents, half-siblings, and divided holidays with varying degrees of grace. What made the Kasem arrangement distinctive was the combination of significant wealth, public visibility, a large and gated residence, and the gradual emergence of a hierarchy within the family that the older children would eventually describe not as mere favoritism, but as deliberate exclusion. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the household at Holmby Hills projected an image of affluent normalcy. Casey continued his broadcasting work, cycled through various incarnations of the Countdown format, and maintained his voice acting career alongside public appearances that reinforced his genial public persona. Jean raised Liberty, managed the social calendar, and cultivated a world inside the gates that reflected her own tastes and ambitions. The estate, later described in various reports as worth between $80 and $100 million, provided the family with every material comfort imaginable, and also with the insularity that extreme wealth purchases. When you live behind gates in Holmby Hills, you can control who enters your life. You can decide which relationships to nurture and which to let wither. You can build a household that reflects your preferences rather than your obligations. For the older children who lived outside those gates, who visited on schedules that were not of their making, who watched through occasional windows into a life that included their father but did not center on them. The mansion was not a family home. It was a symbol of a choice that had been made about who mattered most. Carrie Kasem would later tell interviewers that Jean's initial warmth toward the first marriage children was brief and conditional. The phrase Carrie attributed to Jean was precise, and it carried the weight of everything that followed. Jean began referring to them as the other family. Whether those exact words were spoken once in a moment of frustration or became a recurring description, the emotional truth they convey is what matters for this story. The older children were being reclassified, not removed from Casey's life and not yet, but redefined within it. They were no longer simply Casey's children. They were complications from a prior marriage, visitors in a household that Jean was constructing around herself, her daughter, and her husband. The distinction between belonging and being tolerated is one that every child in a blended family understands viscerally, even when they cannot articulate it. Carrie, Mike, and Julie understood it, and the wound it left was the wound that shaped the final battle. There is something about the Holmby Hills house that is worth sitting with for a moment. It was not merely a home, it was a perimeter. Casey was inside. The older children were increasingly outside. Jean controlled the gates, the calendar, the rhythm of access. The mansion that had been a birthday gift, a romantic gesture at the height of a marriage based, had become, by the 2000s, the physical architecture of a family divided. What happened behind those walls was private. What happened outside them, on the street, in the courts, in front of cameras, would eventually become grotesquely public. But for years, the gates held. The public saw the Kasem name and thought of countdowns and cartoon voices. The older children saw the same name and thought of doors that would not open. It is worth understanding what each person wanted, because the collision that consumed Casey's final years was not random and not the product of one bad actor. It was structural. Casey wanted control. He wanted to manage his own decline with the dignity he had spent a lifetime projecting. Jean wanted authority, the right to decide how her husband was cared for, who saw him, and what version of his condition the world was permitted to know. Carrie wanted access and eventually legal standing. Mike, building a broadcasting career of his own in Singapore, wanted his older siblings' efforts to succeed even if he could not be physically present for the daily battles. Julie, the quietest and in some ways the most legally consequential of the older children, wanted the system to work. She was the one who would first convert the family's grief into paperwork, and Liberty, the youngest, the daughter of both sides of the war, wanted whatever a child wants when the family she was born into starts to eat itself alive. By 2007, Casey had been diagnosed with what Jan later described publicly as Lewy body dementia. The condition is a specific kind of cruelty. It attacks cognition, motor function, and eventually the capacity for communication, and it does so unevenly. Some days better than others, some hours nearly normal, followed by sudden disorientation, a flickering between the person someone used to be and the patient they are becoming. For a man whose entire career was built on the reliability and warmth of his voice, Lewy body dementia was not merely a medical sentence. It was an identity sentence. The thing that made Casey Kasem who he was, the instrument that had earned him trust, fame, love, and money, was being dismantled from the inside. By 2009, Casey stepped away from his radio work. American Top 40, in its various incarnations, had been the center of his professional identity for 39 years. Leaving it was not a career decision. It was an admission that the disease had advanced beyond the point where the work was possible. The microphone went silent. The weekly countdown stopped. The man who had spent 4 decades building trust through his voice now faced a future defined entirely by what happened inside his home, inside his body, and inside the relationships he had built or failed to build with the people closest to him. And inside the Holmby Hills house, the dynamics that Casey's presence and authority had held in fragile equilibrium began to collapse with a speed that surprised everyone except perhaps the people who had been watching the fault lines for years. A family, it turns out, can function with deep internal divisions as long as the patriarch is strong enough to stand at the center and keep the factions from destroying each other. When that center weakens, when the voice that mediated, the earning power that justified the arrangement, and the cognitive capacity that held the alliances together all begin to fail simultaneously, the structure does not gradually loosen, it falls. The older children described a process of escalating isolation. Visits were canceled or shortened, phone calls went unanswered or were screened. Requests for updates about Casey's health were met with silence, with deflection, or with responses that the children found inadequate. Jean's position, as reconstructed from later legal filings and public statements, was that she was protecting a gravely ill husband from the emotional disruption that contested family visits created. The older children's position was that Jean was systematically cutting them off from a father who was too sick to resist and who might not even know they were being kept away. Whether the truth was one of those accounts or some messier, less narratively satisfying combination of both is a question the story never cleanly resolves. What is not in dispute is the outcome. By the autumn of 2013, the older children believed they had been effectively barred from their father's life. In October of 2013, the breakdown went public. Carrie, Julie, and supporters gathered outside the Holmby Hills mansion, holding signs and speaking to reporters. The scene was not a protest in the way the word usually implies. There were no chants, no crowds, no organized spectacle. It was smaller than that and harder to watch. It was adult children standing on a sidewalk in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the world, holding handmade signs asking to see their dying father. Cameras were there because the Kasem name was famous enough to attract them. The images went out across entertainment news. The man who had spent decades making Americans feel connected through a microphone was now the subject of a custody dispute being fought on his own front sidewalk, and the gates behind the protesters remained closed. That same month, Julie and her husband, Dr. Jamila Bulhausen, filed conservatorship papers in Los Angeles. The filing was built on documents Casey had signed in 2007, advanced healthcare directives and durable powers of attorney that gave his older children legal authority over his medical and personal care decisions in the event he could no longer make them himself. Those papers were not improvised responses to a sudden crisis. They had been drawn up 7 years earlier, when Casey was still cognitively capable, still broadcasting, still the functioning patriarch of his family. Their existence suggested that Casey himself, in some moment of private clarity, had anticipated a future in which Jean's authority might need to be checked. Whether he imagined it would come to this, courtrooms, cameras, children locked outside gates, is impossible to know. But the documents were there, and his children were now using them to challenge the absolute control Jean had established over their father's life. Jean countered with the oldest and simplest legal argument available to her. She was his wife. California law gave spouses significant authority over incapacitated partners. She was in the home. She was managing his care. She was the person who woke up every morning in the same house as Casey Kasem and went to sleep every night under the same roof. The older children, in Jean's framing, were intruders. People from a prior chapter of Casey's life who had no right to override a marriage. The family had passed beyond conversation, beyond even the formal hostility of dueling lawyers. It was now operating through competing claims to legal authority over a man who could not resolve the dispute himself, a man who could not even tell anyone which side he wanted to win. And then, on May 7th, 2014, Jean removed Casey from a Santa Monica assisted living facility. She did not inform the older children. She did not notify the court. She simply took him and left. The dispute that had been about visitation, about access, about the right to see and care for a sick father, became something fundamentally different. It became a disappearance. Casey Kasem, 82 years old, ravaged by dementia, unable to speak or care for himself, was gone. His children did not know where he was. The courts did not know where he was. The most familiar voice in American radio had been taken from the place where he was being treated, moved to an unknown location, and the people who loved him could not find him. The fight was no longer happening at the gates of a mansion. It was happening in a void. And the older children were now searching for a man they were not certain they would ever see alive again. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. On May 12, 2014, 5 days after Casey Kasem disappeared from a Santa Monica care facility, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Daniel Murphy convened a hearing that had the surreal quality of a missing persons case dressed in celebrity family clothing. Carrie Kasem was petitioning for emergency temporary conservatorship. Jean's attorneys were trying to contain the situation legally without revealing information that might give the other side an advantage. And the judge, confronted with the disappearance of an 82-year-old dementia patient whose wife had removed him from professional care without notifying anyone, did something that changed the trajectory of the case. He expressed open, visible concern for Casey's safety. He appointed Carrie as temporary conservator, and he ordered an investigation into Casey's whereabouts. Not a family law review, not a mediation, but an investigation, the kind of procedural step that signals a court has moved from adjudicating a dispute to addressing a potential emergency. During the hearing, Jean's attorney made a statement that would become one of the most disorienting details in the entire saga. He told the court that Casey was no longer in the United States. That claim, delivered in a courtroom, in front of a judge, about a man who could not travel independently, could not consent to anything, and could not have participated in the decision to leave the country, landed with the force of something almost theatrical. A judge was being told in a legal proceeding that one of the most recognized voices in American broadcasting had been taken out of the country by his own wife, and his own children had no idea where he was. The statement would later prove misleading. Casey was located within the United States, but in the moment it accomplished exactly what one might suspect it was designed to accomplish. It made the children feel as though their father had been moved beyond their reach entirely. The court ordered California Adult Protective Services and investigators to find Casey. APS, the agency that intervenes in cases involving the neglect, abuse, or exploitation of vulnerable adults, was now formally involved in the life of the man whose voice had once been the most benign, reassuring sound on American airwaves. That institutional escalation was itself a kind of verdict, even if no court called it one. The state of California had decided that whatever Jean Kasem believed she was doing for her husband, his safety could not simply be assumed on the basis of her word. The children who had spent months protesting outside gates, filing motions in courtrooms, and begging for information they were never given were now waiting for government investigators to tell them whether their father was alive and where his body was. On May 15, 2014, 3 days after the hearing, authorities located Casey and Jean in Kitsap County, Washington. They were at a private residence, not a hospital, not a licensed assisted living facility, but a home. The house was reportedly owned by an associate, and the setting bore no resemblance to the supervised medical environment Casey had been in before Jean removed him. The Kitsap Peninsula is a beautiful part of the Pacific Northwest, green, quiet, surrounded by water, and under other circumstances, a house there might have been a restful place for a sick man to spend his final weeks. But Casey had not been brought there for rest. He had been brought there because it was more than 1,000 miles from Los Angeles, in a jurisdiction where the California court's authority was uncertain and where the older children had no established legal standing, no local attorneys on retainer, and no familiarity with the system they would need to navigate. Jean had not simply moved Casey. She had moved the battlefield. Whether the strategy was premeditated, a deliberate jurisdictional maneuver designed to buy time, or improvised in the panic of a woman who felt the walls closing in, the effect was identical. The children had to start over. New state, new courts, new judges who had no prior knowledge of the case, new rules about who could visit, who could petition, and how quickly the legal machinery could turn. Carrie, who had just been granted temporary conservatorship in California, now had to figure out whether that authority meant anything in Washington. It was the kind of procedural nightmare that only money and geographic distance can create. A family fighting not just over a person, but over which state's laws would govern that person's care, which court had jurisdiction, and whose paperwork trumped whose. For the older children, every day consumed by jurisdictional maneuvering was a day during which their father's condition continued to deteriorate without adequate oversight. For Jean, every day of delay was a day during which she maintained physical possession of her husband. The legal system was moving, but it was not moving fast enough to prevent what was happening to Casey's body. What followed over the next 2.5 weeks was a compressed siege, a series of legal motions, court hearings, welfare checks, and physical confrontations that played out across 2 states, multiple courtrooms, and the front lawn of a private residence in Washington, while the national media watched. On May 30th, a Kitsap County judge issued an order granting Carrie daily visits of up to 1 hour and requiring that Casey be examined by a doctor of Carrie's choosing. The hearing also introduced, for the first time in a courtroom, specific allegations about Casey's physical condition that shifted the story from a family custody dispute into something with the texture of a neglect case. Court filings described bed sores. They described a lung infection. They described a bladder infection. These were not the inevitable accompaniments of a man dying from progressive neurological disease. They were the markers of inadequate physical care, of a body that had not been turned frequently enough, cleaned attentively enough, monitored closely enough. The disease was killing Casey Kasem, but the disease was not the only thing that had been allowed to damage him. There is something about the medical details that resists the clean narrative structure of a family drama and demands to be reckoned with on its own terms. A stage 3 pressure ulcer is not an abstraction. It is a wound deep enough to expose the tissue beneath the skin, the fat, the connective fiber, sometimes the muscle. It develops when a bedridden patient is left in the same position for too long, when the weight of the body compresses the blood supply to the skin until the tissue dies. In a hospital or a properly staffed care facility, patients are repositioned on a schedule, every 2 hours typically, specifically to prevent these wounds. The existence of a stage 3 ulcer is in most clinical contexts treated as a marker of care failure. It means someone was not turned frequently enough, monitored closely enough, or cared for attentively enough over a sustained period. A lung infection in a bedridden patient suggests aspiration or inadequate respiratory management. A bladder infection suggests catheter problems or insufficient hygiene. These conditions can develop quickly in frail patients, and they are not always preventable even with excellent care. But their simultaneous presence in a man whose estate was worth tens of millions of dollars and who should have had access to the finest medical attention money could buy raised questions that went beyond the jurisdictional battle and into the territory of basic human responsibility. Someone had been in charge of Casey Kasem's body during those weeks, and the body was telling a story that whoever was in charge might not want told. By late May and early June, the environment around the Washington house had taken on a quality that long-form reporting would later describe in terms that evoke less a family home than a compound under pressure. There were reports of motorcycle riding associates around the property, of unfamiliar vehicles stationed near the entrances, of a perimeter being maintained by people who were neither family nor medical staff. Whether those details are precisely accurate or somewhat exaggerated by the fog of a crisis experienced in real time, they capture the emotional reality of the situation. This was not a family gathering around a sick bed. This was 2 factions of a family attempting to physically control access to a human being who could not walk, could not speak, and could not tell anyone whether he wanted to be where he was. The court-ordered visits, 1 hour per day, were themselves a particular kind of agony. Carrie would arrive at the house, enter a space that was not welcoming, spend 60 minutes with a father who could not speak, whose condition she could observe but not change, whose suffering was visible, and whose future was measured in days or weeks rather than months. And then she would leave, walk back through whatever gauntlet the house's atmosphere presented, and return the next day to do it again. An hour is not a long time. It is long enough to hold a hand, to speak to someone who may or may not hear you, to catalog the medical deterioration that your eyes can see but your legal authority cannot yet address. It is not long enough to fix anything. It is the kind of access that technically satisfies a court order while satisfying no one's actual need. Not the need of the patient for consistent, trustworthy care, and not the need of the children for the authority to ensure their father is protected. The visits were a compromise, and like most compromises in situations this far gone, they left everyone involved feeling that the system had acknowledged the problem without solving it. On June 1st, 2014, the scene that would define the Kasem family in the public imagination played out on the front lawn of the Washington residence. Carrie arrived with a court order, paramedics, and an ambulance. She had the legal authority to have her father examined and, if necessary, transported to a medical facility. The ambulance pulled up to the house, and then, depending on which account you rely on, it was called away. Some reports suggest a simultaneous emergency call diverted the vehicle, others that the situation simply collapsed into confusion. In the gap that followed, Jean Kasem came outside. What happened next has been recorded on video and has been replayed in news segments, documentaries, and online compilations in the years since. Jean, standing on the lawn of the house, threw a pound of raw hamburger meat at her stepdaughter. The footage is brief and chaotic. The act itself is so bizarre that it invites laughter, and many people who have seen the clip have laughed. But the laughter, if it comes, does not last. Because what the moment actually contains is a woman whose control over the situation has collapsed, whose legal defenses have been overridden, whose geographic strategy has been neutralized, and whose husband is dying upstairs, performing the only act of resistance still available to her. A physical, humiliating, absurd gesture that communicates nothing except the totality of the breakdown. The meat is not a weapon. It is not a coherent protest. It is the residue of a fight that has consumed every rational option and has nothing left but flesh thrown at flesh. And Casey lay upstairs, the man whose life had been built on voice, on the warmth and precision of spoken language, on the ability to connect with strangers through the careful selection of words, was silent. He could not call down from the bedroom window and tell his wife to stop. He could not tell his daughter that he wanted to go to the hospital. He could not tell the paramedics his name or his birthday or his level of pain. He could not participate in the scene at all. He existed at the center of it the way a contested object exists at the center of a custody battle, present, necessary, entirely without agency. The voice was gone. Everything else was noise. That single incident, the raw meat, the lawn, the cameras, became the image of the Kasem family that the public would carry forward. It was replayed on entertainment news shows, discussed on talk programs, shared millions of times in the emerging social media environment of 2014. For people who had grown up with Casey's reassuring voice on weekend radio, the footage was jarring, not merely because of what it showed, but because of the distance between what they associated with the name Kasem and what they were now seeing attached to it. The gentle countdown king, the voice of cartoon heroism and listener dedications, now existed in the same mental space as a front yard family brawl involving raw meat, a dying man, and an ambulance that had been called away at the worst possible moment. The public image and the private reality had not merely diverged. They had collided on camera in a way that could never be unseen. In the days that followed, the courts in Washington moved into the questions that had been waiting behind every custodial motion and every access order. Judges were now weighing whether Casey should continue to receive artificial nutrition, hydration, and medication. These were not theoretical bioethics questions. They were immediate, practical decisions about a specific man's body in a specific hospital bed. Jean argued that Casey wanted to live, that he was aware of his surroundings, that withdrawing support would be an act of killing rather than an acceptance of dying. The older children, armed with the 2007 advance directives and supported by the medical evaluations they had fought to obtain, argued that Casey's condition was terminal, that his suffering was prolonged and severe, and that his own documented wishes should govern the decisions being made on his behalf. The family that could not agree on who should visit him could not agree on whether he should be kept alive, and the man at the center of the argument could not cast a deciding vote. Casey had been transferred to St. Anthony's Hospital in Gig Harbor, Washington, and the medical picture, once the doctors were able to fully evaluate him, was devastating. The hospital sits on a bluff overlooking the water, in a town whose name sounds gentle and whose landscape is beautiful in the way that the Pacific Northwest manages to be even in the middle of a crisis. Casey arrived there not as a patient choosing a place to die, but as a contested body finally delivered to institutional care after weeks of private management that had clearly failed him. Julie later described her father as extremely thin, a detail that carries weight because it is not clinical language, but the language of a daughter seeing what disease and inadequate care had done to a man she remembered as whole, as substantial, as the person who occupied the center of her earliest memories. Hospital records, later obtained and reported by CBS's 48 Hours, documented a stage 3 pressure ulcer, septic shock, respiratory failure, and multiple other acute conditions. The records read like a catalog of preventable suffering layered on top of incurable disease. The Lewy body dementia was going to kill Casey Kasem. That was never in question. What was in question was how much additional damage had been inflicted on his body during the months and weeks when his care was subordinated to his family's war. The septic shock alone, a systemic infection that overwhelms the body's ability to regulate blood pressure and organ function, was life-threatening. The respiratory failure meant Casey's lungs could no longer oxygenate his blood without assistance. These were not chronic disease milestones reached over years of gradual decline. They were acute crises that had developed or worsened during the period of contested care, during the weeks and months when the people responsible for Casey's body were too busy fighting over who had the right to make decisions, to ensure that the most basic decisions, turn the patient, treat the infection, monitor the wound, were being made at all. Jean, during this period, took the extraordinary step of holding a press conference at which she played audio recordings of Casey moaning. Her stated purpose was to demonstrate that Casey was being harmed by the court's intervention, that the orders granting Carey access and authorizing medical examinations were causing him distress. Whether the audio proved what Jean claimed or simply captured the sounds of a man in the advanced stages of neurological and systemic collapse is another of the questions this story does not resolve with any neatness. But the act itself, playing the recorded moans of a dying man for journalists and cameras as a legal tactic, reveals something about the depth of the crisis that no court filing can convey. Casey Kasem's voice had been the most publicly shared part of his identity for 40 years. Now, in the final days of his life, even the involuntary sounds his body produced were being broadcast. His suffering had been made into evidence. His pain had become content. Casey Kasem died at St. Anthony's Hospital in Gig Harbor, Washington, on June 15, 2014. It was Father's Day. He was 82 years old. The time of death was recorded as approximately 3:23 in the morning, the small dark hours when most hospital deaths occur, when the corridors are dim and the machinery measures what is ending with a dispassionate precision that does not care about the name on the wristband. Outside, the Puget Sound stretched toward the Olympic Mountains in the pre-dawn darkness, and the world was quiet in the way the Pacific Northwest is quiet before dawn, a stillness that felt almost like a rebuke after the noise that had consumed the preceding weeks. He was surrounded in the final hours by family and close friends, including his brother Mounter Kasem and his longtime friend Gonzalo Venecia. The older children were there. After months of gates and lawyers and courtroom hearings across 2 states, after a disappearance that had required adult protective services to resolve, after a front-lawn confrontation that produced footage the internet would never forget, after the slow, devastating revelation of what their father's body had endured, while the adults in his life fought over who owned his decline. Carrie and Julie and the people who had fought to reach Casey were in the room when he died. They made it. They were present for the last breath. Whether that fact was a consolation or just a different kind of wound is a question that does not have a single answer. But the death they witnessed was not the one that Casey's public life had promised. It was not quiet. It was not peaceful. It was not the orderly conclusion of a life well lived. It was the end of a siege, the final act of a family war that had turned a dying man's last chapter into a news cycle, a legal docket, and a national conversation about who has the right to decide how a person leaves the world. Casey died in a hospital far from home, in a state he had no meaningful connection to, after weeks of physical deterioration, the multiple medical records documented in clinical detail that is hard to read without flinching. The gentle voice was gone. The man behind the voice was gone. And the family that had destroyed itself fighting over him was now left holding the aftermath. The obituaries that appeared in the hours and days after Casey's death did what American obituaries do for beloved public figures. They returned him to his best self. Casey Kasem, the Countdown King. Casey Kasem, the voice of Shaggy. Casey Kasem, the reassuring sign-off. The immigrant son made good. The man who made strangers feel like friends. Tributes poured in from broadcasters, from musicians who remembered hearing their songs announced on the countdown for the first time, from voice actors who had shared recording sessions with him, and from the anonymous millions who had grown up with his presence, threaded through their weekends and road trips and late-night radio sessions. Social media, still relatively young as a morning medium in 2014, filled with memories from people who associated Casey's voice with specific personal moments. A song dedication that matched their own love story, a Saturday morning cartoon that had defined their childhood, a countdown that had accompanied a family drive across a state they could no longer name. The public's Casey Kasem was not a real person. He was a feeling. And the feeling was warmth, constancy, and the reassurance that someone familiar was paying attention. The Casey Kasem, who had actually died in that hospital room, was a man whose body had been fought over like contested real estate, whose involuntary moans had been played at a press conference, and whose family could not agree on the most basic questions of care, access, and mercy. The distance between those two versions of the same man is not a footnote. It is the entire story. That gap between the public Casey and the private one, between the voice the country trusted and the body the family fought over, is the entire story. And the story did not end with his death. John, as the surviving spouse, took possession of the body. The children who had spent months fighting to reach their father while he was alive now faced a truth that might have seemed impossible if the preceding months had not already shattered every expectation. Even in death, Casey was not theirs. The next chapter would not involve hospitals or courtrooms or raw meat thrown on a lawn. It would involve a funeral home, a transatlantic flight, and a cemetery in a country where Casey Kasem had never lived and where no one in his family had any documented roots. The war had outlived the man at its center, and it was about to cross an ocean. Within weeks of Casey Kasem's death, the older children discovered that the pattern which had defined the last months of their father's life, removal, concealment, the strategic use of geographic distance to outrun legal authority, had not ended with his final breath. It had merely shifted from a living body to a dead one. In July of 2014, Carrie obtained a temporary restraining order to prevent cremation of Casey's remains. She wanted an independent autopsy performed, an examination that might answer, or at least narrow, the medical questions about what had happened to Casey's body during the weeks he was in Jean's custody in Washington. The restraining order was granted, but when investigators contacted the Washington funeral home, where Casey's body had been held, he was not there. The remains had been moved to Montreal. Casey Kasem, the man whose older children had been unable to find while he was alive, who had been removed from a care facility and transported 1,000 miles to Washington without their knowledge, had now in death been transported across an international border. The family's fight over his body had gone continental. The revelation landed with a weight that was different from the shock of the earlier disappearance. When Casey was taken from Santa Monica to Washington, there had still been urgency. A sick man needed medical attention, and finding him was a matter of life and potential death. The movement of his remains carried no such urgency. Casey was beyond help, beyond harm, beyond the reach of any medical decision. The body had been moved because moving it placed it beyond the easy reach of the California and Washington courts, beyond the jurisdiction of the judges who had intervened, and beyond the children who had been using those courts to fight for access. In life, Jean had moved Casey to escape one jurisdiction. In death, she moved his remains to escape another. The symmetry was almost too precise to feel accidental, and it confirmed something the older children had likely suspected, but could not have proved during the crisis. That the geographic maneuvering was not desperate improvisation, but a pattern, a repeating strategy built on the same principle every time. Put distance between the body and the people trying to reach it. Force the opposition to start over in a new legal system. Buy time, maintain control. The children were now fighting the same fight for the third time. First in California over access to a living man, then in Washington over custody of a dying one, and now across international borders over possession of a corpse. Each iteration was more surreal than the last, and each iteration stripped another layer of dignity from the story. This was no longer a family dispute about who loved Casey more or who had the right to make medical decisions. This was a fight over a dead man's bones, conducted across 3 countries, and no one involved seemed capable of stopping it. By August of 2014, public reporting confirmed that Jean was planning to bury Casey in Norway. The choice was bewildering to almost everyone who encountered it. Casey Kasem had no documented connection to Norway. He was born in Detroit. His parents were Lebanese immigrants who ran a grocery store. His career was built in Los Angeles and broadcast across the American heartland. His listeners were American teenagers and American families and American soldiers stationed overseas. His cultural identity was as thoroughly American as any person's could be. The son of immigrants who had become, through nothing but talent and work, one of the most familiar voices in the country. And yet his body was being sent to Scandinavia, to a country where he had not lived, had not worked, had not vacationed in any publicly documented way, and had not, as far as anyone could determine, expressed any wish to be buried. Norway was not a sentimental choice. It was not a return to ancestral ground. It was in every practical sense nowhere. A place that had no meaning in Casey Kasem's life story except the meaning Jean imposed on it by sending his body there. Jean's reasoning, to the extent it was ever made public, has never been fully satisfying. Some reporting suggested a connection to her own heritage or personal preferences. Other accounts framed the Norway burial simply as the final expression of the same impulse that had driven every other decision in the crisis. To remove Casey from the reach of his older children, to maintain exclusive control over his memory and his physical remains, and to ensure that the final chapter of his story was written on Jean's terms, rather than on anyone else's. Whatever the motivation, the result was concrete and irreversible. On December 16, 2014, 6 months after his death, Casey Kasem was buried at Vestre Gravlund, a public cemetery in Oslo. 6 months, half a year between a man's death and his burial, not because the family was waiting for a distant relative to travel or because religious custom required delay, but because the fight over where he would be placed in the ground took that long to resolve. Or more accurately, because Jean proceeded with the burial in Norway despite the unresolved objections of the older children. The ceremony was quiet. The older children were not present. They had not been given sufficient notice to arrange travel, or had not been invited at all. The accounts vary, and the distinction between insufficient notice and deliberate exclusion is one that depends entirely on whose calendar and whose inbox you believe. What is not in dispute is the image. The man who had spent 4 decades counting down the American Top 40, whose voice was woven into the weekends of 2 generations of listeners, whose sign-off had become a national catchphrase, was laid to rest in a Nordic capital, in a cemetery whose other inhabitants were overwhelmingly Norwegian, thousands of miles from every place he had ever called home, while the children who had spent 6 months fighting to reach him stood on the other side of an ocean. They had not been there when he was hidden in Washington. They had not been there when he was moved to Montreal. And they were not there when he was lowered into Scandinavian ground. The pattern had completed itself. The legal aftermath ground forward with the relentless, unsatisfying rhythm that contested estates and wrongful death claims always produce. In 2015, 3 of Casey's children, Carrie, Mike, and Julie, along with his brother Mauner, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Jean. The complaint alleged elder abuse and intentional infliction of emotional distress, laying out in the formal language of civil litigation the narrative the children had been living through for years: the isolation, the removal from professional care, the deteriorating physical condition, the refusal to allow contact, the contested medical decision, the disappearance of the body, the burial in a country with no connection to the deceased. Jean filed counterclaims, alleging that the older children's legal interventions had caused Casey harm, that their pursuit of conservatorship had been motivated by financial interest rather than filial love, and that she, as his wife, had been the one truly acting in his interest all along. The family, which had not been able to agree on a single thing during Casey's life, not where he should live, not who should see him, not what medical care he should receive, not whether he should be fed, was now unable to agree on the meaning of his death. Each side accused the other of the same fundamental sin, that their actions had caused suffering to a man who deserved peace. Neither side could prove it beyond the ambiguity that attends every contested death. Both sides believed it completely. In 2018, a Washington State Police review closed its investigation into Casey's death, concluding that there was no evidence of criminal conduct and that the medical care Casey had received in Washington had been appropriate. That finding was narrow and specific, though deliberately so. It addressed whether a crime had been committed under the statutes available to Washington prosecutors. It did not address whether Casey had been well cared for in any broader human sense. It did not resolve the question of the bed sores, the infections, the dramatic weight loss, or the chasm between the level of care that Casey's substantial fortune should have been able to provide and the condition in which he was actually found when he finally reached the hospital with the authority to evaluate him independently. The police review closed a criminal file. It left every other question, moral, emotional, familial, exactly where it had been. Unanswered, unanswerable. In 2019, the dueling wrongful death lawsuits were resolved through a confidential settlement. No one stood before a camera and explained what had been agreed to, what had been admitted, or what had been surrendered. The terms were sealed. There was no public apology, no shared statement of grief, no acknowledgement from either side that the other had acted out of love or fear or desperation rather than malice. The legal system, which had been the family's primary arena for 5 years, the place where they fought when they could not fight in person, the institution they turned to when love and conversation and basic human decency had all failed, closed its doors on the Kasem case. A confidential settlement is, in a certain light, the legal system's admission that some disputes cannot be resolved. They can only be ended. The money changes hands or it does not. The accusations are withdrawn or they are not. But the story each side tells itself about what happened, that story is not subject to negotiation, and no settlement can change it. The Kasem family left the courtroom carrying separate versions of the same events, and those versions will never be reconciled. The Kasem case did not fade from public memory the way most celebrity family disputes do. It became instead a reference point, a case study in the gaps and failures of American elder care law, and a story that people in similar situations recognized with an immediacy that entertainment news alone could not have produced. CBS's 48 Hours devoted a full episode to reconstructing the timeline, using hospital records, court documents, and interviews to build a narrative with a level of specificity that real-time news coverage, constrained by the pace of a daily cycle, had not been able to achieve. The episode laid out the medical details, the jurisdictional maneuvering, and the emotional devastation with the thoroughness of a production that understood it was documenting not just a celebrity saga, but a systemic failure. Long-form magazine journalism followed. A detailed feature in GQ examined the Kasem story as something richer and more disturbing than tabloid melodrama, as a parable about contested conservatorships, about the vulnerability of people who cannot advocate for themselves, about what happens when the American legal system encounters a family whose members have the financial resources to fight indefinitely and the emotional damage to guarantee that they will. Recent coverage in People kept the story alive for a new audience, connecting the original crisis to Carrie's ongoing advocacy and to the 2024 visit to Oslo that brought the narrative full circle. The story outlived the settlement. It outlived the news cycle. It became the kind of cautionary tale that legislators, elder care advocates, and families facing their own guardianship nightmares pointed to as evidence that the system needed structural reform. Casey Kasem's name, which had once meant warmth and weekend rituals and the comforting order of a countdown, now also meant something darker. A lesson in what can go wrong when a family's private dysfunction meets an institutional framework that was never designed to handle it. The surviving members of the Kasem family have taken paths so divergent in the years since the settlement that they seem to confirm, in their very separateness, the impossibility of this family ever having functioned as a coherent single unit. They do not appear to be in regular contact. They do not speak publicly about one another. They have become, in effect, the fragments of a name that no longer holds together. Carrie Kasem is 53. She lives in Los Angeles and has continued as the most publicly visible of the older children, building a media presence and advocacy identity around her organization. Kasem Cares. The organization's stated mission is elder abuse, awareness, and education. And Carrie has used it as a platform for speaking engagements, podcast appearances, television interviews, and lobbying efforts aimed at strengthening guardianship protections and ensuring that family members cannot be systematically denied access to elderly relatives by a single controlling party. She has worked with legislators in multiple states, testified before committees, and positioned herself as a subject matter expert on this specific kind of family dysfunction that allows vulnerable adults to be isolated, relocated, and effectively disappeared by the people closest to them. Whether the advocacy is healing, or whether it keeps the wound open by requiring its constant re examination, or whether those two things are the same thing dressed in different language, is a question only Carrie can answer. What is visible from the outside is that she chose not to let Casey's story end with the settlement. She became the keeper of the older children's version of events, the one who refused to let the public memory of Casey Kasem settle back into warm nostalgia without acknowledging the ugliness of how it ended. Mike Kasem built a long-running media career far from the world his father inhabited. Based in Singapore, working as a radio and television personality with MediaCorp and the station Gold 905, Mike carried the Kasem instinct for broadcasting into a market on the other side of the planet. There is a particular kind of irony in that trajectory. Or perhaps not irony, but something closer to inheritance without replication. Casey Kasem had built his entire career on the intimacy of the American listener relationship, on the specific cultural frequencies of American popular music, on the understanding that his voice meant something particular to people who heard it every Sunday. Mike took this skill, but not the context. He built a career in Southeast Asia, in a market where the Kasem name carried recognition among some older listeners who remembered American Top 40 through its international syndication, but where it was not freighted with the same family history that made the name toxic in certain American contexts. The geographic distance is striking and may have been the point. Mike did not try to replicate his father's career in his father's country. He went as far as a broadcaster can go while still working a microphone and built something that was his own, in a language and a market that did not require him to explain his surname every time he introduced himself. Julie Kasem, who had been the first of the children to move the family's conflict into the legal system with the 2013 conservatorship filing, chose a different path after the settlement. She retreated from public life more completely than either of her siblings, living privately with her husband, Dr. Abul Hossein, and their children, appearing only occasionally in podcast interviews or media appearances connected to Casey's legacy. Of the three older children, Julie is the one whose post-crisis story is the least visible. Not because she was less affected by what happened, but because she chose to carry it without an audience. In the narrative structure of this family, Julie functions as the one who did the hardest institutional work during the crisis. She filed the conservatorship papers. She put her name on the legal documents. She and her husband staked their professional reputations on the claim that Casey was in danger. And then, once the crisis ended, she stepped back from the public stage that the crisis had created. She chose the privacy that her father had never been able to achieve, and that by the end of his life, he had not been permitted even in death. Liberty Kasem maintains a public presence as a singer-songwriter and creative figure. She is the daughter of both sides of the Kasem War, Jean's child and Casey's child simultaneously. And the public record contains almost nothing about her interior experience of the crisis that consumed her family. She was 24 when her father died. She had spent her entire childhood inside the Holmby Hills house, on the side of the gates that her half-siblings could not get through. She grew up in the household that Jing constructed, in the world that Jing controlled, with a father who was famous for being gentle and a mother who was, by the accounts of the other side, fiercely territorial about the boundaries of that household. Whatever Liberty saw during those years, whether she witnessed the older children being turned away, whether she understood the escalating legal battles, whether she experienced Jean's behavior as protection or as something else, she has not made it public in any sustained or detailed way. She remains the most opaque figure in the story, the family member whose silence is not a public stance, but a private choice, and the person whose position in the family makes any simple allegiance impossible. To side with her mother is to reject her half-siblings' account of their father's suffering. To side with her half-siblings is to condemn the woman who raised her. Liberty exists in the space between those two impossible choices, and the public does not know which one, if either, she has made. Joan Kasem still appears occasionally in media connected to Casey's memory, but in public life, she has become far quieter than she was during the years of open warfare. The woman who held press conferences, who moved her husband across state lines, who threw raw hamburger meat on a front lawn in full view of cameras, who transported Casey's remains to Montreal and buried him in Oslo, that woman receded from view after the confidential settlement closed the legal chapter. Whether the retreat represents exhaustion, strategy, the advice of attorneys, or simply the natural end of a fight that had consumed everything it could consume and left nothing more to contest, the visible result is the same. Jane lives in whatever version of the story she tells herself. She is not explaining it to the public. And the public, which made its judgments years ago based on the footage it saw, is not asking. In 2024, 10 years after Casey's death, Carrie Kasem traveled to Oslo to visit her father's grave for the first time. She had never been to Vestre Gravlund. She had never stood over the place where her father's body was buried. For a decade, the grave had existed as an abstraction, a fact she knew but had not experienced with her own body, a location on a map that existed in a country she had no connection to and no reason to visit except this one. The distance from Los Angeles to Oslo, from the Holmby Hills gates to a Nordic cemetery, was not merely geographic. It was the physical measure of everything the family's war had cost. A daughter had been unable to visit her father's grave for 10 years, not because she did not want to, not because she lacked the means, but because the grave was on the other side of the world, placed there by someone who had ensured that even the act of mourning would require a transatlantic journey. What she found when she arrived was a detail that carries everything this story has been building toward. The grave had originally been unmarked. There was no stone, no plaque, no inscription, nothing to indicate who lay beneath the ground. The most recognizable voice in American radio, a man who had been inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame, who had a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, who had spent 4 decades signing off with words that millions of people could recite from memory, had been buried in an anonymous plot in a foreign cemetery with nothing to mark his name. And then a stranger, someone in Oslo who had no connection to the family, no legal standing, no emotional stake, no reason to care except that they cared, had placed a small plaque on the grave so that Casey Kasem's resting place would not go entirely unacknowledged. A person who had never met him had done what his own family could not. A stranger had honored the dead man more gently than the people who had fought for years over the right to claim him. Casey Kasem spent his career offering Americans a controlled, orderly, comforting version of popular culture. The numbers made sense. The stories landed cleanly. The long-distance dedications connected strangers to each other through a voice that promised continuity, warmth, and the assurance that someone was paying attention. Every countdown ended the same way with the same 7 words, and the familiarity of that ritual was the product itself. The thing that kept people coming back for 39 years. His own family's story ended in the opposite register. Competing houses, competing children, competing legal orders. A patient who could not speak. A body that disappeared. A grave on the other side of the world that his own children did not visit for 10 years and that a stranger had to mark. What that reveals is not a lesson about fame or money or second marriages. It is something less tidy and more honest than any of those frames. It is what happens when the people inside a family stop agreeing on who belongs to it, and the one person who might have settled the question has already lost the ability to say a single word.